What's good, everybody? I'm Jared, about to check out the darkest year in WWE history. This video is about Wrestle Mafia. Um, I'm pretty sure it's 2007, which was one of the most incredible years as far as like in-ring action on the roster, but behind the scenes, tragedy struck. We got, unfortunately, Chris Benoit did what he did. We don't need to get into that. We're gonna let Wrestle Mafia get into that. But 2007 was a pretty good year, man. Undertaker won the Royal Rumble, eliminated Shawn Michaels to become the first ever man to enter the Rumble at number 30 that year. He went on to choose Batista. They had an incredible rivalry extending from WrestleMania 23 on to later down the summer. Got a chance to see Shawn Michaels and John Cena become tag team champions as well as opponents, and they also faced at WrestleMania 23. Donald Trump went against, not in the match, but Donald Trump and Vince McMahon had a Battle of the Billionaires match where Trump had Bobby Lashley representing him while Vince had Umaga representing him, and Lashley ultimately defeated Umaga. Ultimately defeated Umaga, and it was a hair versus hair match at that between the two billionaires. Vince got his head shaved, and you know what I'm saying, amongst other things that happened, he got blown up in a limousine that same year. Edge returned. Edge became World Heavyweight Champion on the episode of SmackDown. So much didn't happen in the year 2007, man. So we about to hop into this video and see what Wrestling Mafia has to say about it. I've been drinking Sprite, so it got me burping, y'all.
WWE in 2007 was off to a hot start. You had John Cena versus Shawn Michaels, Batista versus The Undertaker, and WrestleMania broke pay-per-view records with Trump shaving Vince bald. It seemed like the company had finally found its footing in the post-Attitude Era landscape. But then, everything went downhill. What followed was an unprecedented cascade of real-world tragedies, career-ending scandals, devastating injuries, intense media scrutiny, exploding limousines, and government investigations that all culminated
it's crazy.
in the
Triple
darkest
H
period
really
WWE
wasn't there
ever
too much
experienced.
during that
While
year.
the product on television still remained decent,
Like
with
early
stars
part
like
of the
Cena,
year, he was
Batista,
gone.
Edge, and Randy Orton leading the charge, behind the scenes, WWE was fighting for its very survival as controversies mounted week after week. So what exactly made 2007 the darkest year in WWE history? What were the tragedies, scandals, and disasters that almost caused the wrestling industry to crumble completely? And how did a company that started the year with such promise find itself desperately trying to rebuild its reputation from the ground up? Let's find out.
Chapter 1.
Let's start by talking about the darkest tragedy in WWE history that changed everything. The weekend of June 24th, 2007 began like any other pay-per-view weekend for WWE. WWE Vengeance was set to take place in Houston, and one of the most anticipated matches on the card was Chris Benoit defending his ECW championship against the up-and-coming CM Punk. But when showtime arrived, Benoit was nowhere to be found. Initially, WWE officials were told that Benoit couldn't make it due to a family emergency involving carbon monoxide poisoning at his home. While the news was concerning, these things happened occasionally in wrestling, and the show had to go on. Johnny Nitro was quickly substituted into the match, defeating CM Punk to become the new ECW champion. Throughout the night, fans and fellow wrestlers kept wondering where their beloved technical wrestler had gone. But behind the scenes, a much darker reality was unfolding. WWE officials couldn't reach Benoit by phone, and as hours passed without contact, panic began to set in. The company was already dealing with the fallout from Vince McMahon's exploding limousine segment, which was supposed to culminate in a special 3-hour tribute episode of Raw the following night.
And I remember
Instead,
that
the planned
he got blown
Memorial
up in the
show
limousine.
was quickly scrapped when
I
news
remember
broke
watching
that
that
would
episode
change
of
everything.
Raw.
On Monday afternoon, just hours before Raw was set to air, police discovered the bodies of Chris Benoit, his wife Nancy, and their 7-year-old son Daniel at their home in Fayetteville, Georgia. Initial reports suggested a possible family tragedy. Perhaps the carbon monoxide poisoning that had been mentioned earlier. In a state of shock and confusion, WWE made the decision to transform their planned McMahon tribute into a Chris Benoit memorial show. For 3 hours, WWE superstars sat with tears in their eyes, sharing memories of Benoit and showcasing his greatest matches. They showed his Royal Rumble victory, his WrestleMania triumph, and countless technical masterpieces that had made him one of the most respected wrestlers in the world. Edge broke down on camera. William Regal spoke about Benoit's dedication to the craft, It was a touching tribute to a man they all believed had died tragically alongside his family.
Nah.
But as the show progressed, more details began emerging from the police investigation. This wasn't a family tragedy or an accident, it was something darker. Chris Benoit had killed his wife Nancy, his son Daniel, and then taken his own life. The revelation hit WWE like a nuclear bomb.
Did that. That
Vince
ruined his
McMahon,
whole
who had been
legacy.
dealing with his fictional death storyline, now faced a very real crisis that threatened to destroy his company's reputation forever. The next night on ECW, a visibly shaken McMahon appeared on television to address what had become apparent. With one of the angriest expressions ever seen on his face, he promised that Chris Benoit's name would never be mentioned on WWE programming again. But the damage was already done. The wrestling world had just broadcast a 3-hour tribute to a man who had committed one of the most heinous crimes imaginable, and mainstream media was about to pounce on the industry like never before. Within hours of the Benoit tragedy being revealed, every major news outlet in America descended upon pro wrestling like vultures. CNN, Fox News, ESPN, and countless other networks launched into wrestling with a vengeance. The narrative painted WWE and pro wrestling as a cesspool of steroid abuse and violence. When wrestlers like Kevin Nash appeared on Fox News to provide context and defend their industry, they were met with hostile interrogation rather than genuine discussion. The media's approach was ruthless and often dishonest. Anchors who had never watched a wrestling match in their lives suddenly became experts on the industry and painted every wrestler as a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. What made the media assault particularly devastating was its timing. Wrestling had already been dealing with public perception problems since the end of the Attitude Era, and this gave critics the ammunition they needed to paint the entire industry as irredeemably corrupt. But the media firestorm was just the beginning of WWE's problems, because as reporters dug deeper into the wrestling world, they uncovered a scandal that would forever change how WWE superstars looked and performed.
Steroids.
As if the media scrutiny following the Benoit tragedy wasn't devastating enough, WWE was about to face an even more immediate crisis that would gut their roster and expose the widespread use of performance-enhancing drugs throughout the industry. The investigation had actually begun months earlier, in February 2007, when Sports Illustrated started looking into a potential steroid distribution network operating out of Florida. What started as a routine investigation quickly expanded into something much larger when major wrestling names began appearing in the records. Kurt Angle was the first major star implicated, though he denied any wrongdoing. But Angle was just the tip of the iceberg. On March 19, 2007, Sports Illustrated dropped a bombshell article revealing that multiple wrestlers had received prescriptions from Dr. David Wilbert in Arizona between November 2004 and April 2005. The initial list included names like Eddie Guerrero, Rey Mysterio, Randy Orton, Edge, and Gregory Helms. Edge's response was particularly damaging to WWE's credibility. Rather than denying the allegations, he admitted to using steroids after his neck injury, explaining that they were prescribed to help the bones grow back around the screws and plates in his neck. The situation exploded on August 30th, 2007, when the New York Daily News published a comprehensive list of wrestlers who had received steroids and other drugs from internet doctors. 12 current WWE wrestlers were named, and the fallout was catastrophic. Chavo Guerrero, Shane Helms, Randy Orton, John Morrison, Mr. Kennedy, Funaki, Charlie Haas, Umaga, William Regal, Edge, and several others were suspended for violating WWE's wellness policy. The timing couldn't have been worse. WWE was already dealing with the Benoit aftermath and intense media scrutiny. Now they were losing another dozen
a lot of this stuff I didn't know because at the time I was 11.
Had to be rewritten overnight. Umaga lost the Intercontinental Championship to Jeff Hardy. John Morrison was stripped of the ECW title and lost it to CM Punk. And countless other angles were abruptly terminated. But perhaps most heartbreaking was Mr. Kennedy's fall from grace.
That's why he lost the Money in the Bank contract to Edge.
Next big star, chosen to be revealed as Vince McMahon's illegitimate son in what was supposed to be a career-defining storyline. Instead, his suspension ended his push, and the angle was quickly rewritten.
That's why the storyline went to Hornswoggle.
The scandal didn't stop there. Congress got involved and demanded records from WWE, dating back to 1998. TNA was also asked to provide information, making this an industry-wide crisis. But even as WWE reeled from suspensions and media scrutiny, their problems were about to get worse. As if the Benoit tragedy and steroid scandal weren't devastating enough for WWE's roster, 2007 also became a year where it seemed like every major star was cursed to suffer career-threatening injuries at the worst possible moments. The injury plague began early in the year when Triple H suffered a devastating quad tear that would sideline him for 7 months. The timing was horrible since Triple H was being planned for a high-profile WrestleMania rematch with John Cena, forcing WWE to completely rewrite their biggest show of the year at the last minute.
That's
Shawn
why they
Michaels
gave it to
stepped
Shawn
into
Michaels.
Triple H's spot, creating one of the best matches in WrestleMania history.
I don't
with
think
Cena,
it could have been
but
better.
losing HBK's original opponent meant further reshuffling
If
of an
Triple H
already
would have been there.
complicated
I
card.
don't think it would have been
The
better.
domino effect of a single injury was already causing problems, but this was just the beginning of WWE's medical nightmare. The Undertaker, who had been having a career renaissance with his world title run and matches against Batista, went down with a torn bicep that forced him out of action for months. Edge, fresh off winning the World Heavyweight Championship and positioned as SmackDown's top heel, suffered a pectoral injury that forced him to vacate the title he had just won. Bobby Lashley, who had been built as ECW's franchise player, also suffered injuries that disrupted his momentum.
I ain't know Bobby Lashley
But
got
perhaps
hurt.
the most devastating blow came when John Cena, WWE's undisputed top star and face of the company, tore his pectoral muscle in October. The injury bug was so severe that by the summer of 2007, WWE's main event scene had been reduced to Batista, Rey Mysterio, Randy Orton, and King Booker. When you combine the injuries with the suspensions, WWE was left with a roster so thin that they were forced to put the World Heavyweight Championship on the Great Khali, not because he was the best choice, but because he was one of the only credible heels left standing. But WWE's crisis went beyond just immediate injuries and suspensions. These mounting disasters forced the company to make changes that would reshape the wrestling industry forever.
Shut the fire.
The mounting crises of 2007 forced WWE into a desperate period that would fundamentally alter the direction of pro wrestling forever. What emerged was a complete philosophical shift that transformed WWE from the edgy, controversial shows that had defined the Attitude Era into something entirely different. The most immediate change came in response to the Benoit tragedy and the growing understanding of CTE in the company. Unprotected chair shots to the head, which had been a staple of hardcore wrestling for decades, were immediately banned following the discovery that Benoit's brain showed damage equivalent to an 87-year-old Alzheimer's patient. The company also implemented stricter concussion protocols and enhanced their wellness policy, which had originally been created after Eddie Guerrero's death. More frequent testing, stricter penalties, and increased medical oversight became the new standard as WWE tried to prove to critics that they were serious about performer safety. But the most visible change was WWE's gradual shift toward family-friendly programming. This wasn't entirely due to the 2007 controversies. There were financial incentives to pursuing a PG rating that would attract more mainstream advertisers and sponsors. However, the events of 2007 accelerated this transition dramatically. Network executives and advertisers who might have overlooked wrestling's edgier content were now actively distancing themselves from anything associated with WWE's violence and controversy. The move toward PG programming was evident in small changes at first. Hornswoggle began appearing in more child-friendly segments. Blood was gradually reduced, and storylines became less focused on adult themes. The gritty look of Raw was abandoned. Hardcore matches became increasingly rare, and the overall tone shifted from rebellious entertainment to something parents could watch with their children. WWE's decision to go HD in 2008 provided the perfect cover for this transition, but industry insiders knew the real motivation. The company needed to rebuild its reputation from the ground up, and that meant abandoning everything that had made wrestling controversial in the first place. Kelly Kelly couldn't do her provocative, extreme expose segments anymore. Storylines became less personal, and the general atmosphere had to become more sanitized. WWE was moving away from the crash TV mentality that had defined their success in the late 1990s towards something that could survive mainstream scrutiny. This shift toward PG programming would define WWE's content for over a decade, fundamentally changing how storylines were written, how characters were developed, and what kinds of matches could be presented. However, even as WWE was implementing these changes to salvage their reputation, 2007 still had more tragedy in store.
What else happened?
What had already been the darkest period in WWE history became even more devastating as a cascade of wrestler deaths created an atmosphere of genuine fear. The year saw the deaths of Bam Bam Bigelow and Mike Awesome within a month of each other in early 2007. Bigelow
at that time, wrestlers were dying right before
from a drug
age
overdose,
50.
while Awesome was only 42.
They were dying
in
young.
March, Bad News Brown and Ernie Ladd died within the same week, creating an eerie pattern that had wrestlers genuinely worried about who might be next. June brought the death of Sherry Martel from a drug overdose. The media used each death as evidence of wrestling's toxic culture, creating a narrative that painted the entire industry as a death trap. August brought yet another tragedy when Bryan Adams, known to fans as Crush, died at age 43 from mixing prescribed medications. Beyond the deaths, WWE was dealing with a host of other problems that would have been major crises in any normal year, but seemed almost minor compared to everything else happening. ECW was on life support after Vince McMahon's comedy championship reign killed whatever credibility the brand had left. The cruiserweight division became such a joke that WWE actually put the title on Hornswoggle. Creative teams were constantly rewriting shows due to suspensions, injuries, and other real-world crises interrupting their storylines. The threat of federal intervention loomed over every decision, making company executives paranoid about every aspect of their operation. Looking back at 2007, it's remarkable that WWE survived at all. Any one of these crises could have ended a smaller company. The combination of all of them should have been fatal. Yet, Vince McMahon and the WWE managed to survive the darkest year in history. But let me know what you think. Is WWE today better than it was in 2007? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
As like now, 2026, 2025, 2026, I can say yeah. I think as far as like injuries, they're in the same predicament that they was in 2007, because a lot of their major stars are injured now. Anybody that can make WrestleMania the biggest ever are now injured, so they got to work with what they got. So I think that's probably like the two similarities that they may have between now and back in 07. But overall, 07 still was a pretty good year as far as wrestling. But let me know down below in the comments of what y'all thought of my reaction to this video. Like, comment, subscribe. Until next time, I'm out. Peace.